You might think pirates spent their days clinking rum bottles and swinging from rigging, or fighting off royal navies with one eye on the treasure chest. Well, plot twist. Their biggest enemy wasn't cannonballs or mutiny. It was Mother Nature's wrath in the form of Category 5 hurricanes. But here's the kicker. While storm winds shredded sails and tossed ships like carnival rides, one nightmare stayed constant: how to actually cook food without turning dinner into a literal shipwreck. I mean, imagine trying to fry fish when the ocean's mixing your kitchen like a blender. It's not exactly a culinary showstopper. Let me tell you something wild about cooking on pirate ships caught in the worst storms of the Caribbean and beyond. Because the solutions these salty sea dogs came up with were as clever as a fox in a henhouse and a lot messier. Before we dive into flaming pots and shaking kettles, picture this: a pirate ship like the Queen Anne's Revenge, sailing with 70 men on board in the early 1600s. Now, a Category 5 hurricane slams into the Caribbean roughly once every 10 years, sometimes hitting these wooden death traps square on. Winds topping 150 miles per hour, waves gnarly enough to swallow a small house, and decks so slippery your best pirate would look like Bambi on ice. And guess what? Amid all that chaos, the crew still needed to eat and somehow cook it. But how? You can't just slap some grub over a fire when the whole ship's flipping like a pancake. Turns out cooking during these monstrous storms was a bigger pain in the cannon than you'd imagine. First off, fresh food was already a rarity. Pirates mostly survived off hardtack, salted pork, and dried peas. Think of it as the 17th century version of emergency rations, but less tasty and infinitely crunchier. But even those ironclad provisions needed a little hot water, or some kind of cooking attempt to be digestible. Fresh water was scarce too. Each pirate required at least 1.5 gallons a day just for drinking and rinsing food. That adds up fast. An entire crew of 70 meant a daily quota of over 100 gallons of precious water, which became increasingly contaminated by salt spray and storm runoff. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by drinking salty, gritty brew. So, how on earth, or rather how at sea, did they pull this off when the deluge was showing no mercy? Here's where it gets interesting. Pirates tried plenty of things before hitting on actual workable methods. Spoiler alert: most of these attempts failed spectacularly and sometimes resulted in more problems than solutions. For instance, one common solution was trying to cook meals inside the galley, a small cabin in the rear of the ship designed to shelter the fire and pots. That probably sounds logical until you factor in hurricane winds ripping through the rigging, tossing everything from kettles to cooking racks around like toys. Pirates reported pots flying off stoves mid-boil, sometimes boiling over and soaking the entire galley with salted meat broth. The smell alone was enough to turn even the toughest pirate's stomach, not to mention the near impossibility of keeping a flame alight during those 36 to 48-hour storms. Bad idea. Really bad idea. In one recorded case from a tempest near Tortuga in 1673, a crew tried securing their cooking pots with hemp ropes tied in sailors' knots. You can probably guess how that ended. The ropes frayed under storm strain, kettles smashed onto the wooden floor, sending scalding broth everywhere along with shards of iron. Several pirates had minor burns, and morale took a nosedive, which in pirate terms is basically worse than a shortage of rum. So, cooking inside during the storm was a no-go unless you wanted spontaneous fires or a boiled-up mutiny. Next, some tried an outdoor approach, thinking the open air might solve their flaming pot predicament. Pirates would lash kettles to the deck, far from the galley, hoping the storm would blow flames away and prevent indoor smoke. But hurricanes don't care about clever strategies. They're basically nature's blender set to high speed. Winds would snatch flames in a flash, turning fires into patchy flickers. Without consistent heat, cooking times stretched from hours to days, risking food spoilage. And when the crew attempted to shield fires with cannon barrels or oilskins, the winds would funnel flames unpredictably, sometimes igniting sails or ropes. Fire and hurricane, not a combo recommended, unless you're auditioning for history's angriest pyromaniacs. The real kicker was seafood. Pirates loved eating freshly caught fish, but trying to grill or boil fish during a Category 5 hurricane was the culinary equivalent of juggling eels on a trampoline. Waves crashing over the deck introduced seawater into cooking pots that already struggled to stay warm. Salt water in your stewing fish. Imagine a salt overdose so intense even the saltiest pirate's tongue begged for mercy. Plus, the motion made it impossible to keep halves of fish intact. Fillets turned into unidentifiable mush, sometimes catapulting off the ship entirely, providing unintended carpaccio to passing gulls. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. But pirates figured out something clever, pinpointing that cooking fires needed to be stabilized and enclosed without suffocating the flame or letting the ship's chaotic movement put it out. Enter the iron box stove, or as historians politely call it, the sea chest cooker. These were small, box-like iron stoves with doors and vents, bolted firmly to the bulkhead to minimize wobbling. The design allowed cooks to light a controlled fire inside, shielded from wind but still ventilated enough to feed the flame. Not exactly modern kitchen standards, but for a bunch of swashbucklers climbing rigging in storms, it was pretty genius. Pirates didn't know it at the time, but the iron box stove worked because it created a semi-closed combustion chamber that stabilized airflow. In modern terms, think of it like a camp stove with a windscreen but anchored to the ship. It increased fire temperature and reduced fuel waste, which was critical since wood and coal were finite resources, especially during extended storms when resupply was impossible. This method boosted cooking success rates to around 70% even amid gale force winds, which is impressive if you consider that wave height could reach over 30 feet, big enough to swallow a double-decker bus. One famous example from logs aboard the Witta Galley, Black Sam Bellamy's ship sunk in 1613, describes how the crew used a modified iron box stove during a Category 5 storm near the Bahamas. Despite the pitch-black conditions and gusts nearly leveling the mainmast, the cooks managed to boil a batch of dried peas mixed with salted beef for lunch. The secret wasn't just the iron box, but also their practice of lashing down cooking equipment with additional sea ropes and soaking burlap sacks in seawater to dampen sparks. It's like their version of fire safety goggles and seat belts combined. Of course, not everything about iron box stoves was perfect. Many pirates complained about the smell, something between burnt wood, salty smoke, and whatever mystery meat was cooking that day. This was the 17th century equivalent of opening a can of sardines on a cramped subway car, only worse. Still, it beat the alternative, cold hardtack punched through with wiggling worms found during longer voyages. Pretty gross, sure, but at least those iron boxes kept hungry pirates a little less grumpy. Now, with fire finally somewhat under control, pirates faced another hurdle, keeping food from turning into a soggy, moldy mess after cooking. Hurricanes brought oppressive humidity that ramped up spoilage rates dramatically, especially for salted pork and dried peas stored in wooden barrels with as little as 15 to 20% humidity tolerance. A ship's hold packed with 63-gallon barrels of salted meat and dried goods might start sprouting mold within 24 hours if a Category 5 storm flooded the lower decks. Pirates quickly learned that cooked food left to sit wasn't just a waste, it was a biohazard waiting to happen. Eating spoiled provisions wasn't exactly the best way to keep up your swashbuckling charm. Their solution? Turning to creativity that mixed seasickness and culinary necessity, they developed makeshift storm kitchens on the highest dry parts of the ship, usually the forecastle, to keep food elevated and air flowing. They jury-rigged platforms from spare planks and barrels, using rigging ropes and canvas tarps to shield the cookpots from rain and spray, while maximizing ventilation. Not exactly Michelin star quality, but think of it like a pirate's version of outdoor grilling combined with disaster camping. One hilarious story involves Captain Charles Vane, no stranger to bad luck and stubbornness, who insisted on cooking his salted pork over a tiny open fire on the forecastle during a hurricane near Jamaica in 1718. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The fire kept getting doused by waves crashing over the deck. Eventually, to keep the flames alive, Vane's crew had to sacrifice part of their food rations just to fuel the fire, literally burning some of their precious salted pork to cook the rest. Talk about a lose-lose situation, but at least it kept them fed for another day and gave them something to argue about over grog afterward. Now, while cooking storms raged, pirates also had to keep meals somewhat balanced. because eating nothing but salted pork and hardtack turns even the fiercest pirate into a hanger monster. Vitamin deficiency was a real problem, especially scurvy, caused by lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. But fresh produce rarely survived a week on deck, let alone during a storm. Pirates got around this partly by catching fresh fish right before the storm struck, then cooking it quickly using their iron box stoves or storm kitchens. But that only helped if the fish didn't get tossed overboard first, which was a common and highly frustrating event. Imagine hauling in your dinner just to watch it disappear into the ocean, courtesy of a rogue wave. Because nothing says fine dining like eating air-flavored seaweed instead. And while we're talking about food and storms, you might wonder about the role of alcohol. Pirates didn't just drink rum to look cool. Part of the reason was its limited ability to disinfect and preserve. During Category 5 hurricanes, water supplies could get contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. But barrels of rum or beer were less likely to spoil quickly. Pirates actually used diluted rum to sanitize cooking utensils, and even to help purify water in a pinch. Think of it as their version of emergency hand sanitizer and water purifier rolled into one. Not exactly health code approved today, but in the middle of a hurricane, it was better than nothing and definitely better than drinking seawater. Although the aftertaste might have been enough to make even Blackbeard think twice. Stick around, because we're not even halfway through the chaos of pirate cooking during Category 5 hurricanes. Next up, we'll dig into their bizarre food preservation hacks, how they dealt with smoke-filled galleys, and the one weird trick pirates used to turn salty seawater into something you could actually gulp down without gagging. Spoiler: it involves a lot less rum and a lot more sand than you'd think. Alright, so by now you're probably thinking, cool, pirates nailed the cooking part during hurricanes with their iron box stoves. Problem solved, right? Nope, not even close. The real battle was keeping their water drinkable and their food edible during a Category 5 hurricane, when the ship basically becomes a floating blender pirate nightmare combo. Let's talk water first, because without it, the whole pirate party ends before it starts. Now, a crew of 70 guys requires roughly 105 gallons of fresh water every single day. That's a ton of weight and storage space, considering water's heavier than a drunk parrot on shore leave. But here's the kicker. During a Category 5 hurricane, the barrels that stored this precious H2O would get slammed. Salt water would splash inside, lids would pop off, and even the best sealed casks sometimes turned into salt soup vats. Spoiler alert, pirates not exactly rushing to drink seawater, no matter how fresh it was. And remember, this was before any fancy water purification systems. No bottled water, no life straw, just good old barrel storage and grumbling thirst. Pirates knew the water problem caused emergency situations faster than a mutiny. They tried a bunch of things. For example, double-barreling their water storage. That means putting one barrel inside another, hoping the outer barrel took the brunt of salt spray and the inner one stayed fresh. Before you picture pirates playing barrel Russian roulette, let me tell you, bad idea, really bad idea. The moisture between barrels attracted mold and, even worse, maggots. Yep, tiny creepy crawlies turning pirate water into something worse than the fish they tried cooking. You can probably guess how that ended. Half the crew refusing to drink anything but suspiciously salty rum, and the other half facing some serious dehydration headaches. Another brilliant attempt involved soaking burlap sacks in seawater and hanging them over deck rails to let the salty water drip. Pirates thought maybe some kind of natural filtering or evaporation would make it drinkable. Here's where it gets interesting. Turns out, soaking burlap sacks in salt water is a fantastic way to get soaked burlap but not fresh water. It was basically artisanal pirate towel ringing with zero hydration payoff. Let's just say it wasn't pretty, and morale sank faster than the ship's lifeboats. So, what did pirates actually do when barrels turned salty and they faced thirst during days-long storms? They turned to an ancient method known as distillation, but with a pirate twist. Because a distillation setup is basically boiling water and catching steam, which heated the ship and required an even steadier fire during the worst storms. Remember the iron box stove hero? Yep, that bad boy doubled as a distiller. Turns out pirates accidentally discovered how to create makeshift distillation chambers by covering cooking pots with inverted metal or wooden lids. and attaching leather or metal tubes that ran vapor into separate containers. It's basically their version of a water treatment plant, born out of pure desperation and a pinch of explosive ingenuity. This setup allowed them to evaporate seawater and collect condensed freshwater, though it was slow, around 24 hours to get enough fresh water for a handful of men, and far from convenient for a whole crew. Still, during the worst hurricanes, this method was 75% effective for keeping the most important pirates hydrated and functional. It was a lifesaver on ships like the Fancy, captained by Henry Every, who documented this method during a hurricane off Madagascar in the late 1600s. And no, they didn't have YouTube tutorials. It was trial, error, and a lot of burnt fingers. Speaking of burnt fingers, the smoky, stuffy galley running iron box stoves during storms wasn't exactly five-star. Smoke would pour into the ship's ventilation systems, which in theory pulled air through the hull's small holes, but in practice meant the entire ship occasionally resembled a bad barbecue pit. Pirates tried all kinds of tricks to reroute smoke. One hilarious attempt documented on Black Bart Roberts' ship in the West African coast around 1720 involved attaching sailcloth funnels to chimneys to catch smoke midair and guide it overboard. Spoiler alert, hurricanes are not gentle zephyrs. The funnels shredded in 36 hours, blowing smoke right back down into the galley. Crew had to rotate cooks every 20 minutes just to escape smoked-out lungs, basically the original smoke. Break, but way less fun because they weren't vaping, just gasping. All right, so with water problems getting more solved and cooking sauces burning less, what about food preservation after cooking? Hurricanes brought humidity so intense that the usual salted pork and hardtack dried out, and then suddenly got moldy in under 24 hours, sometimes giving the crew more allergic reactions than cannonballs. Pirates being pirates, they tried storing food in barrels wrapped in tarred cloth. The idea was to keep humidity out but still maintain ventilation. Bad news. Tarred cloth trapped more moisture when it rained, turning barrels into mini greenhouses for mold spores. Pirates called it the cursed barrel and often avoided those that smelled like the devil's own footlocker. Enter the real genius. Pirates started introducing charcoal into food storage barrels. Seems weird, but charcoal is basically a natural moisture and odor absorber. Think of it as the 17th century equivalent of your fancy neoprene fridge bags. Pirates didn't know the chemistry but accidentally created microclimates, where humidity wasn't high enough to foster mold growth. The charcoal also soaked up many of those unpleasant odors from salted meat that could otherwise ruin the stoke of a pirate meal faster than grog at a sober bachelor party. This trick boosted food preservation effectiveness by around 50% during stormy weeks when the ship's hold became a sauna. Pirate ships like the Victory confirmed this in their logs from a Caribbean storm in 1707, noting fewer cases of food spoilage and slightly less grumbling from the cook's quarter. Now, let's get back to that one weird trick. I teased earlier about turning salty seawater into something drinkable without chugging rum or gagging like you just bit into a mermaid's toe. It turns out the answer was sand, specifically fine beach sand brought on board during brief shore stops. Pirates used this sand in oversized barrels lined with layers of cloth and gravel to filter seawater before boiling it in their iron box stoves. It's basically the original slow-motion aquarium filter with a pirate touch. The sand removed grime, some salt crystals, and even tiny bits of seaweed, making the water less repulsive for distillation. This primitive filter increased the efficiency of their water-making apparatus by about 30%, which back then was like finding a buried treasure chest full of fresh water bottles. Here's an ironic historical anecdote. On John Rackham's ship in 1719, during a hurricane just east of Cuba, the crew discovered a washed-up metal sieve buried in the sand on a tiny island. After scraping it clean, they used it in conjunction with their sand filter barrels and recorded drinking clear enough water to avoid getting scurvy symptoms for days afterward. Pretty impressive for a bunch of sea rats who usually preferred stabbing each other to figuring out science stuff, right? So by now, you're probably wondering, with all these DIY water purifiers, iron box distillers, and barrel charcoal tech, did pirates actually manage to not starve or drown during the worst of these Category 5 storms? The honest answer is, half the time, no. These methods were clever but far from foolproof. Mutinies often sparked from starvation and thirst, and many crew members ended up sick or worse due to contaminated food or lack of hydration. But here's the thing. Pirate ingenuity in the face of nature's absolute worst was borderline admirable. They might be caricatured as rum-guzzling treasure hunters, but they were also crash-course survival engineers trapped on wooden barrels of gunpowder swinging through hellish seas. And here's a final sting for you. Despite all this tech, the biggest threat to pirate cooking survival during Category 5 hurricanes was still good old-fashioned pirate chaos. Cooking equipment got stolen, food barrels were liberated during drunken brawls, and water often got wasted when someone left barrels open or used it to wash their boots. Because nothing says fearsome pirate crew like pestering each other over spilled salt water and burned meat mid-storm. So next time you think pirates spent their big hurricane days relaxing with rum, remember they were locked in a daily, sweaty, salty battle, with storms trying to cook meals without the ship, becoming a floating crematorium or mold factory. Their iron box stoves, sand filters, and charcoal barrels may sound primitive, but they were the lifelines keeping 70 salty rogues fed, hydrated, and ready to plunder another day. After all, what good is a treasure chest if you starve or drown before you reach it? Pirates teaching us that survival isn't just about swords and cannonballs. Sometimes it's about how cleverly you boil hardtack and don't chug seawater. And honestly, that's pretty impressive for a bunch of buccaneers.